So, as Dr. Umbrus mentioned, I do research and analysis on pollutants in the environment that can harm our health, and I work to provide the most current scientific information and data to inform better decisions to protect people's health. And my work is supported by a grant from the Schmidt Family Foundation. As Dr. Umbrus mentioned, I am appointed to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee. I was appointed in President Trump's first administration, and I was reappointed under President Biden. This is not a political issue. We're all here because we care about our children's health and our families' health, and that's the foundation that I'm approaching this from. I've done research on chemical recycling and pyrolysis facilities across the US, and I'm here today to provide information that I hope is useful to inform this discussion. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So I'll touch briefly on the basics of pyrolysis, so we'll all be on the same page on that. Then I'll review the major sources I use to gather information that I'll talk about. I'll describe the facility's federal categorization and registration, and review what was found in the Bay Area Air Quality Management District emissions and toxic risk screening analysis that we just heard about as part of the permitting process. And then finally, I'll touch on some additional health considerations. So here, this is a really simplified version diagram of pyrolysis. We saw the really nice diagram Mr. Bauer presented earlier of their system. So basically, you take your plastic waste, you chop it up into little pieces, put it into the pyrolysis reactor under heat and pressure, and you get out the three main things: these gases that are also called the non-condensable gases, the liquid, which is called pyrolysis oil, and a solid called charm. So when I was making this diagram, my husband was like, "What are you doing? What is this?" And I was like, well, you know, it's like a really, really simple idea of it is like you heat up a piece of pizza, right? Any pyrolysis process uses heat. They use different heat sources. So you can heat up your pizza in the microwave, you can do it in the toaster oven, you can do it on the stovetop, and you're still gonna get out the same basic results. You'll get the nice gases coming off the top, the steam, lovely aromas. You'll get the oil dripping down the side from all the great cheese and pepperoni, and you'll get the solid, maybe a nice char on that crust, depending on how hot you like it. So it's the same with pyrolysis. You always have these same three things coming out: the gases, liquid, and solid. And a type of pyrolysis has been used in fossil fuel refineries for many decades, called steam cracking. So in that sense, pyrolysis is not a new process. We heard from Mr. Bauer some of the differences and distinctions between the different types of pyrolysis. So I mentioned this engineering evaluation that I'll be referring to, and I do have some printed out copies of it up front here on the bench for anyone that hasn't seen it and would like to take a look. And this engineering evaluation was based on the Resynergi permit application materials that were submitted. And I'll also talk about information from EPA's Enforcement and Compliance History Online, or ECHO database, which has 2 entries for the Resynergi facility at this address, so I'll go over both. So here's part 1. This is what you see in the detailed facility report. If you scroll further down the page, you also get some information about its categorization under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA for short, which is the law that governs hazardous waste. So what we can see here is the facility is categorized in the industry of oil and gas extraction. It's registered under RCRA. It's currently inactive for crude petroleum extraction. This facility is handling fossil fuel products, as was mentioned. What we see in the other facility report is similarly, we see the industry categorization, chemical manufacturing, again, a registration under RCRA, and that is currently inactive for chemical product and preparation manufacturing. And just one thing I would mention is that other plastics pyrolysis facilities have reported hazardous waste generation to US EPA, so that's something to keep in mind for the future potential. And then in the engineering evaluation, this is on page 27, so this is referring to 40 CFR 60, that's the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 40, Part 60. This is the Clean Air Act. And as Mr. Bauer mentioned, the facility is categorized as having an other solid waste incineration unit. And it refers to the definition in 60.2977. You can see there what the definition is. Either a very small municipal waste combustion unit or an institutional waste incineration unit. So there's this question, is it combustion, is it incineration, is it or is it not? And I think what I would say is that from my perspective, what I'm more concerned about is not what you call it, but what is coming out of it. So let's take a look at that. So in the engineering evaluation, they identified a few different sources of facility emissions. So here's the same diagram that I put up earlier, and I've added now the storage tanks where the pyrolysis oil is stored. And the light blue outlines indicate all the sources of emissions identified in the engineering evaluation. So first, the plastic waste stockpile and the shipping pelletizing operation generates plastic dust or particulate matter known as PM. And then over here in these components, the evaluation identified direct and fugitive emissions. So the direct emissions are related to the predicted combustion products from burning the non-condensable gases and the gases that are coming off from the pyrolysis oil in this thermal oxidizer. So this was mentioned as well in terms of the pollution control device. So the non-condensable gases are generated from the pyrolysis process. The pyrolysis oil is a liquid, but there's volatile components, vapors that come off of it. So that is also directed to this thermal oxidizer where it is burned off. And that generates emissions when you combust those items. There's also these fugitive emissions. So what is this about? It's nothing to do with that great 90s Harrison Ford movie, but related concept in that there's emissions, there's things sneaking out where you might not expect. So anywhere that you have a valve, a flange, a pump, any sort of connector, it's not going to be 100% airtight. There can be tiny gaps in the seals where these volatile emissions can sneak out. So you can think about like if you're pumping gas in your car, right? You can get that chemical smell, which I used to love when I was a kid. My mom always told me it wasn't good for me, but that is the volatile chemicals from the gasoline coming out and fugitive emissions, right? That the seal from the pump into your car isn't 100% airtight, so those volatile chemicals are coming out into your nose. That's what you're smelling. So that's these fugitive emissions that can escape throughout the system where there's any sort of connectors. Okay, so emissions. So here's the chemical emissions that were included in the engineering evaluation. So all of these chemicals have health hazards of concern. So we're looking here at these three columns. There's the chemical listed down the left side, and then I'm going to fill in information on whether the chemical is a carcinogen or developmental or reproductive toxicant. As I said, all of these chemicals have health hazards of concern. I chose to highlight these particular health hazards as of special concern for children's health. So you can see the chemicals that have other health hazards, and then where there's one check mark filled in, that means it's either a carcinogen or a reproductive developmental toxicant. 2 check marks means both. So you can see here, there's quite a number of these chemicals that have these health hazards of concern, as well as other health hazards. So next, what the engineering evaluation did is take this information and then look at how much of these chemicals, the quantity, the amounts coming out, to understand the risks presented to people's health. So that's the toxic risk screening analysis, or human health risk assessment that was mentioned. So how does this process work? So first you start off with some basic assumptions. The first assumption is that there's no carcinogens coming out. That means that's 0 risk of additional cancers in the population. Next, you use the scientific assumption that any level of exposure to a cancer-causing chemical carries some risk with it. And there's a policy decision for the target risk level that you want to make sure you keep the risk at or below. So the regulations allow this certain level of excess risk, and here that's set as 1 excess cancer case in 1 million people. So 1 in 1 million is that number. Now, someone saying you're 1 in 1 million can usually be a compliment about how unique you are, but this is not the 1 in 1 million you would want to be, the unlucky person that got cancer here. So what did the analysis find? This is from the engineering evaluation. The health risk assessment indicated the project cancer risk to be 6.9 in 1 million. So it's about 7 times greater cancer risks of concern than the regulatory target level, based on the information the facility provided in their application. Some additional health considerations I wanted to mention based on information about other plastics pyrolysis facilities. Some of the acute hazards that we've seen with these facilities, as well as additional sources of emissions and other types of chemicals and emissions of concern that can contribute to health risks. This name, you all, it's like reminds me of Texas sweet tea or something. I grew up in Texas, like sweet crude. Okay, so what hazards do we have here? So we see it's extremely flammable, may cause genetic defects, may cause cancer, suspected of damaging fertility, definitely some concerning hazards here. And the risks of fires and explosions. So regardless of the heat source for pyrolysis, whether it's microwaves or burning natural gas or lasers, there's many different types. It's inherently in the reactor. It's a high heat and high pressure process with flammable materials going in, right? The plastic inputs, as well as flammable outputs, the pyrolysis oil. So the process can be sensitive to operator error, to contamination in the inputs, to equipment malfunctions. So this paper here was written about a facility in the EU, in Denmark, and I have a few copies of the paper here as well for anyone that wants to take a closer look at it. So just briefly, I'll quote a little bit from what they wrote here. So they said, initially, the local community welcomed the pyrolysis activities, not least because of the prospect of much-wanted employment opportunities. Complaints about nuisance odor and noise gradually cooled the enthusiasm. After the first explosion in 2020, concerns were raised about the soundness of having pyrolysis activities in the middle of a small community and close to the local school, but the political support for green tech companies was unwavering. A chief executive of the local authority stated the pyrolysis company was an up-and-coming enterprise with major development plans for the local community. After the second explosion in 2021, the community reaction turned hostile. The mayor said that an accident that cannot and must not happen had now happened twice. Political support disappeared and various legal options to halt operations were considered. Not much could be done, however, because the company had all the environmental permits, which according to law cannot be renegotiated for a grace period of 8 years. This is the EU though, this is the EU, Denmark. The immediate cause of the two explosions is auto-ignition of flammable pyrolysis vapors. Because the pyrolysis process temperature is higher than the auto-ignition temperature of the pyrolysis gases, a source of ignition is always present inside the pyrolysis reactor. So that was their conclusion after investigating what happened at this pyrolysis plant. And this article I'm showing here from Inside Climate News details some quite hazardous spills and fires and other conditions at a pyrolysis plant in Indiana. So some potential substances of concern that were not included in the evaluation. Microplastics that would be generated from handling and shredding the plastic waste. Mr. Bauer did mention dioxins and the fact that those are not generated or emitted in their process. This is a concern if any plastics that contain chlorine or bromine, for example, polyvinyl chloride or PVC, yet in the pyrolysis process can form dioxins and potentially emit those. Mr. Bauer also mentioned PFAS and the destruction of those in the thermal oxidizer, definitely a concern if there's any emissions of those from the oxidizer. So a few sources of emissions and other fugitive emissions that weren't included. So I would say emissions on startup, shutdown, or malfunction, which are typically higher than when the reactor is already up and going and operating. If there's fugitive emissions from transfer of pyrolysis oil to the trucks. And in the evaluation, all the emissions are predicted or modeled, which can be checked with monitoring, which I was very glad to hear is a part of the permitting process, that the monitoring has to be done to ensure compliance with the emission levels. So here's just an example of another pyrolysis facility. This one is in Ohio, named Altera. Also doing plastics pyrolysis. What the letter says is when they actually measured what was coming out of the facility, it was higher than the estimated emissions. So we have a saying in science that models are always wrong, sometimes they're useful, so it's really important to actually measure the emissions, do the monitoring to ensure that the modeling is accurate. The risk analysis thinks about one chemical at a time, but there's a lot of scientific evidence that carries additional risks than if you were just exposed to each one of those chemicals separately, that those effects can add up and be cumulative or synergistic. And these chemicals all have multiple health hazards, not just cancer, that we would want to make sure are evaluated as well in terms of the risks. So here's just an example for two of the chemicals from this table, benzene and ethylbenzene. You can see that in addition to having the health hazards of carcinogenicity and reproductive and developmental toxicity, they're also neurotoxicants, liver toxicants, cardiovascular, respiratory, and kidney toxicants. So want to make sure that the health hazards are comprehensively evaluated. And I mentioned some of the resources I have printouts of up here on the bench. Feel free to come take a look. There's some more basic information on chemical or advanced recycling as well. And thank you very much. My email is here, and I'm happy to take questions. what we've seen of fires at other facilities that stockpile plastics, those can actually burn for some amount of quite a bit of time and be difficult to put out. So the plastic stockpile itself is a fire concern, as well as the flammable materials on site. And when those fires have occurred at other facilities, oftentimes the community is ordered to shelter in place so that they're not exposed to the excess particulate matter and other chemicals that are produced from uncontrolled combustion of plastic and oils.
Thank you. Sorry if I put you on the spot.
Yeah, it's a very good question. You know, I would agree that the standards we have in California are really the best in the nation and quite protective. So I think having that and ensuring compliance is the first step. I remain concerned about the microplastics issue because what we see from other recycling facilities, even mechanical recycling facilities, at any time you're shredding and pelletizing plastic, you do get emissions to air and water. So I think that's an issue that could be further looked into because microplastics aren't regulated in terms of the emissions. They're not going to be in the permit conditions.
Thank you. Cindy, before you leave,
Get up to make sure I got the acronym right. It's NAICS, North American Industry Classification System. That's the code that was in US EPA's database for the registration of the facility. So that's those NAICS codes are what federal agencies use to classify businesses and industries for their statistical purposes. And they can be self-identified and assigned or assigned by.
I'll just ask it again. You can say if you've already answered it. If you were on the faculty here at Credo, or your child attended school here, or your family lived across the street, what's your real concern level? Not theoretical based on what you've read of other facilities, but what you've heard tonight, your personal evaluation, what's your real concern level?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because I think as the speaker said earlier about everyone has their own acceptance of different risk levels. So mine might not be the same as yours or as other members of this community, and I don't live here. You know, I live in San Francisco. I think what I would say though is that these local planning processes give the community an opportunity to determine what they think is appropriate and what is not. So, for example, in San Francisco, big box stores like Walmart or Target, they can be perfectly compliant with all legal requirements, but San Francisco has decided there's only certain places those stores can go because that's what we want as San Franciscans in terms of the character of our city. So I think it's really up to the community to look at the information and decide what they think is acceptable and appropriate for themselves.